one of the ways my channel sustains 70,000 views a month, 80,000, currently we've been running 90,000 views a month for a couple months in a row, is that people are always going back and digging up my old videos. Sometimes, yes, to embarrass, shame, and humiliate me. In this case, I got a letter from the audience from someone who was watching news stories about the United States of America and their plans to raise the minimum wage. And they went and looked at my back catalog of videos discussing the question of the advantages and disadvantages of a $15 an hour minimum wage in the United States of America. He writes in and saying, it was fascinating to rewatch my old videos on this topic. Are you saying that Western society, in a way, exports its poverty to other countries? Question mark. Continue the quotation here. That it should seek to distance itself from importing exploitative goods as it has with China and other developing countries? Question mark. Now, the very next sentence is also interesting because the next thing he says is, quote, I guess that's a given. Close quote. There are two very interesting issues being raised by this question. One is minimum wage itself, and the other is autarky. This is autarky spelled with a K. We have two words that sound exactly the same in English with completely different meanings and a slight difference in spelling, right? Autarky, the idea that a country, that a national government should pursue self-sufficiency and should cut itself off from what we would now call globalization, international market, international trade in goods. This idea has come up again and again. When I was a child, it was still popular on the left, and it was practiced in some of those moderate socialist countries that were complete and utter disasters and that never get discussed in the same way that communist China, North Korea, or Stalin's USSR get discussed. This is always the bitter irony of people saying, oh, learn the lessons of history. Have you read much about the history of Jamaica? There's history all over. I'm not being ironic at all. I'm not being facetious. You have a lot to learn from the history of Jamaica. Everyone's ignoring it. What do you mean learning the lessons of history? Well, I kind of know a few anecdotes about World War II and the Vietnam War and how women got the vote. Yeah, that's history. The omissions, right, are even more significant than the inclusions when we construct this notion of history and the lessons of history. When people are preaching that we learn the lessons of history, what they're normally asking us to do is disregard about 90% of the world's history and focus on just a few carefully selected propaganda lessons drawn from the history of the world. Right next door to China is a country called Myanmar. In Myanmar, they had state socialism, not communism, and they openly said that the path they were pursuing was not communism. But they were influenced by Karl Marx and Marxism, and among the policies they embraced was autarky. Now, totally non-socialist, non-communist country that also played games with this notion was Australia, right? Australia had the idea, obviously at least in part a result of World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, that they should make up a whole list of goods that they should achieve self-sufficiency in, like cotton. Oh, what a great idea. We should just grow all our own cotton. We shouldn't export cotton from Egypt, right? Both in Myanmar and in Australia, in very different ways, these policies were disasters. And they were disasters of a kind that's easily ignored, right? Now, what do I mean? Well, what happened under Stalin in Russia, what happened under Mao Zedong in China, or on a smaller scale, it's actually an interesting contrast to Myanmar, the incredibly violent history of communism in Cambodia. Those things are hard to ignore. There's a museum in the middle of Phnom Penh, capital city of Cambodia, to the disaster that was communism in Cambodia. And every year, huge numbers of tourists and also huge numbers of local people, school children, go to this museum and learn about how terrible communism was in Cambodia. There is no museum anywhere to the failures of moderate socialism, right? Not in Myanmar, not in India, not in Africa, Africa has a long history of really interesting socialist, not communist countries that failed, right? And not in places like Australia, where it was only just one piece of the puzzle, right? But again, didn't define everything the Australian government did, but obviously it influenced many things, including the development of their car industry that eventually failed. Many parts of the economy were shaped by that notion. Before my time, Canada had some interest in this notion that everyone in Canada should be forced to buy washing machines made in Canada, because otherwise they'd buy washing machines that were manufactured by evil Americans. This is before it was dreamed of that washing machines would be built in Mexico or China, right? You have probably already guessed from my tone of voice that in contrast to this message from a viewer who obviously has only the best intentions, this is a viewer who watched my earlier videos about minimum wage and who took from it the lesson that I was not trying to teach, that somehow naturally the necessary implication of what I'm arguing is that we should refuse to import goods from China. We should refuse to import goods from Mexico. Where should we not refuse to import goods from, right? I understand this isn't quite declaring autarky outright, right? But this is comparable, right? To some extent, I think what you're saying is you'd put up a fence around Europe, for example. Like it wouldn't just be Switzerland saying they're going to make everything they need in Switzerland, but you put up some kind of fence around these regional blocks, and you would stop importing things from China, stop importing things from all over the world, from Africa, so on and so forth, right? So why is that wrong? Why is that? I think wrong is the correct word. What did Myanmar do wrong? Why did Myanmar, render itself one of the poorest countries in the world through what seemed like a kind of well-researched, scholarly approach to socialism that was partly informed by Karl Marx, partly informed by Theravada Buddhism, didn't go to the extremes of imitating Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin. I mean, honestly, if you read it on paper, the social program of Ne Win in Myanmar, I think still to this day, many left-wingers, many Europeans and many Americans who supported Bernie Sanders say, oh, well, this sounds great. It sounds like it. And, by the way, they were also committed to providing free education and free health care and uplifting poor. All kinds of socialist, the desiderata of socialist society were rolled up in this. But I would say, to simplify economic history slightly, because there were a lot of things economically wrong with socialism. It's not just one problem. But to simplify slightly, that one issue of autarky, of cutting off all international trade, all importing and all exporting, basically, right? Of trying to pursue self-sufficiency, of saying we can grow our own cotton, we can make our own clothing, we can manufacture our own shoes, right? That alone so utterly doomed Burmese society and the Burmese economy that, of course, after just a few decades, there was no way they could provide their own education, their own electricity, their own sewage systems, their own shoes, their own clothes. The whole country, amazingly, after the end of the British Empire, after independence, got poorer and poorer because they were committed to this path of socialist autarky. Okay? If you're going to buy shoes, who should you buy shoes from? All right? What if the reason why we buy Chinese shoes is that they're the best? What if China is the best country in the world in making shoes? Right? And it's not just price, right? Price, quality, all things considered. If China is the greatest country in the world in manufacturing shoes, why should we not buy our shoes from them? Right? And what happens when you decide, for political reasons, that you're going to refuse to buy shoes from China? Now, the computer this is being filmed on was manufactured in China. The video camera attached to the computer was manufactured in China. The microphone is from China. The lamp is from China. I was going to say the bench I'm sitting on is from China. Not sure. Maybe Indonesia. I live in Canada, but even the wood products in this room were not made in Canada. Were not imported from Canada. They're from abroad. So it is not as simple as saying, oh, well, we should just embrace the ethic or ethos of importing whatever is the best because it is the best. No. There's a huge fundamental problem here, which, as I've already pointed out in earlier videos, doesn't just have to do with minimum wage, but has to do with maximum wage also. What you need is for different countries, different cities, different communities, different neighborhoods to compete to see who is the best at making shoes, right? In terms of some kind of meaningful competitive advantage, and not just in terms of who has the worst labor regulations, who has the lowest wages, who has the worst controls in terms of law and order for everything from pollution, so-called economic externalities like water pollution or how much water you can use up. Law and order encompasses many other things also, including rule of law as it relates to the investors who may, in an unseen way, lurk behind the creation of the factory and the exploitation of the labor and all the rest of it, right? If you have global competition for low wages, then if just one country anywhere in the world has wages that are, say, 1% of what the wages would be in your country, you have a situation like we have now with basically the whole world in relation to communist China, where everyone increasingly over time is buying absolutely everything made in China. Now, there are numerous other absurdities. People in California cross the border to Mexico to get dental work done because dentists are paid so much less in Mexico, right? Obviously, in some sense, the value of a dentist performing the same dental surgery on you in California and the value of that service in Mexico, it should be the same, or it should only differ in price by 10%, 20%, 50%. We shouldn't be having these dramatic differences in wages, all right? So, are these just two mutually incompatible ideals that can never be realized in the real world? No. It's incredibly easy to harmonize these ideals, and I think that's part of why, I personally feel uncomfortable talking about this problem. Because this is one of those cases where the solution is very easy to talk about, and the problem is actually quite complex. It's quite difficult to say anything meaningful about the problem itself, right? What is the solution? Globalized minimum wage. Period. You need a globally harmonized minimum wage, and you need to have all of the countries that agree to be part of that bloc to meet whatever that minimum wage is, agree that they're going to have some kind of trade sanctions against the people that are outside of the bloc. You can have a very simple set of excise, import duties and fees, so that if you're importing something from a country where they pay their citizens half the wages your country pays its own citizens, where you're doubling the price of it at the border. Of course, you can fill in the blanks for how you exactly want to do the math. You can think through the details. So the solution is incredibly simple. And the solution is easy to preach because it's good for all of the participants. You get to say to people in Mexico, hey, when you work in a factory manufacturing a car, you deserve to be paid the same amount as a white American working in a factory doing the same work to manufacture the same car. And indeed, you can say to the Mexican dentists, you deserve to be paid the same amount for doing this dental operation as an American dentist would be paid. Like, we can't have a kind of genetic bias, like as if because you're born in Mexico, you should be paid less to do this work than America. That's fundamentally unjust. That's fundamentally unfair. So it's easy to see how you can mobilize the Mexicans to ask for this higher wage. And you can turn to the people of Detroit, people within the United States of America, and say, look, you should be able to compete to see who can make the best car, not on the basis of who can pay their workers the least, but who really has an advantage, who is really making the best pair of shoes, who is really making the best car, not who is grinding down their employees to the lowest possible standard. So I'll continue just reading this question. So this is interesting, though, because I feel like the ghost of autarky is kind of haunting this discourse. And, as stupid as the idea of autarky is, it is fundamentally stupid to think that Australia can farm cotton better than Egypt. It is stupid to think that Australia would be better at making cotton and clothing than India or Bangladesh. There is just no reason to think that, okay? And I remember I was giving advice to members of the government in Laos. This is in Southeast Asia. Laos is a small country just north of Cambodia. They were talking about competing against the Chinese in making China, i.e. in making porcelain, that in English language we call China, the type of white porcelain China is famous for. I was sitting there saying to them, China is the best in the world at this. Okay? You are never going to be able to make China cheaper than China. You are never going to be able to make it at a higher quality than China. What you people need to do is find something that you are the greatest in the world at. You know, you're not going to make better tea than China, and you're not going to make better teacups either. And I just mentioned, I mean, these people were Communist Party officials, but they were really receptive to this. Nobody had ever talked to them that way before. They were all people who'd grown up studying Karl Marx, you know, and so they had some education in economics, but to have someone say to them, look, this is not the way economics works. Like you trying to imitate China, or even trying to close your border, like to force your own population to buy teacups made in Laos instead of teacups. All right, and it's subtle, but in that way, step by step, throughout the whole economy, right, autarky destroys your economy, and a lot of it has long-term implications. I remember seeing an interview with an entrepreneur in India, and he'd gone on to become incredibly successful. And he was asked about how things had changed, I think in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in India. I don't think he was old enough to remember the 1960s. And he said, oh, it was hell. He said the government of India tried to force us to use all computers and all computer parts made within India. And he said for the basic things in his business, and he had to fill out all these forms and go to the mayor's office and go to Parliament. He had to deal with all these government officials just to get an exception handed to him so that he could import a computer from Japan to do basic things in his business. This was a huge fight because the government at that time had this agenda for autarky, for so-called self-reliance, right? And nobody's thinking about what's lost. Because even if today you think, oh, well, in the short term, you know, it's better for India if we force them to buy computers made within India. No. What's best for India is that if people use the greatest computers made anywhere in the world, if they're able to import and use the best computers from Japan simply because they are the best. And by using those computers, you will create a whole new generation of people in India who have the know-how and the savvy in terms of computer programming, both hardware and software, to go on to create, you know, the next generation of computer technology can then happen in India. But if you don't, if you cut them off from that, right, you're stuck. You're perpetually behind. You're cut off from those developments. So it's not obvious. Like, what is the point? What is the point of allowing me to import this computer and this camera and this lamp from China, right? But you have to kind of think of it in terms of full life cycle analysis. All right, the disadvantages, the way in which protectionism and autarky, the most extreme form of protectionism, the way in which that kind of corrodes society at every level and every stage, right? Oh, well, now I can't get shoes made in China anymore. Like if you're living in a country like Myanmar or you're living in a country like Canada, suddenly I have shoes at a dramatically lower quality at a dramatically higher price. Somebody's got to fix the plumbing. Oh, well, we can't get pipes made in China anymore, nor can we get them made in Germany, the United States. Oh, we can only use locally made pipes to fix the plumbing. Like, oh, we can't get computers from Japan anymore. Step by step, you know, repairing the plumbing becomes incredibly expensive and incredibly low quality. The growing of cotton in Australia becomes an environmental disaster and a disaster in terms of the waste of taxpayers' dollars, right? Step by step, these things really can corrode your society in a way that most people, well, put it this way, in a way that's not obvious if you read those Burmese propaganda pamphlets that were describing the path forward to socialism and what their justification was for autarky, coming out of the background, I mean, as almost everyone in the world did, coming out of the background of the experience of World War II, and just thinking about independence and self-reliance as very positive things. It's hard to see the harm that's done. By the way, the genesis of this whole train of thought in politics and political science is by Bernard Mandeville, a book that is curiously titled The Fable of the Bees. That is really the beginning of capitalist liberalism as a political philosophy, believe it or not. That is step one. And as the title indicates, it's told with a kind of playful fable, even though it's making a deadly serious point. That, as he puts it, private vices are in fact public virtues. When you look at society economically, things that we think are virtues are vices, and things that we think are vices are virtues. All right. So he says, repeating part of this, we're going to finish this comment, quote, "Are you saying that Western society in a way exports its poverty to other countries? That it should seek to distance itself from importing exploitative goods as it has with China and other developing countries? I guess that's a given. What I really wanted to ask, is there a point where minimum wage can be mismanaged? Perhaps if politics pushed it too high, $15 is reasonable, he says, and reached some kind of upper bound, would that be detrimental to supporting the poor by, say, driving up the cost of living? Okay, close quote. You are going to get absolutely zero false optimism from me on this, okay? Increasing minimum wage causes misery in every part of society. It forces a transformation in the way human beings interact with everyone else. You stop having a society of waitresses at small coffee shops who have plenty of time to talk to you, and you start having a society where all restaurants are organized like Chipotle, where the customers stand in line like they're queued up at a prison to have the food put onto a tray with a ladle, right? As soon as you're paying every waitress or every employee at this restaurant $15 an hour, right? The nature of the restaurant itself changes. The nature of human interactions, the extent to which people can even talk to you or even listen to you changes. I had a friend who worked as a chef, so he worked in restaurants a large part of his life, many decades of his life, and he talked about the way in which not just higher wages, but tighter labor controls in France forced him to be an asshole to his employees in a way he never wanted to. It was one of his reasons for leaving France. I met him out in Asia. But, he said he hated the fact that he couldn't let his employees go outside and smoke a cigarette. And he couldn't let them talk on the phone for 15 minutes with their girlfriend or something, because they were at a point where they were being paid so much per hour. There were all these labor regulations. And it's like, man, I need you to be rolling this dough. I need you to be making these croissants. I need to get every minute out of you because I'm paying you so much, under these conditions. So yeah, there is a great deal of misery in all of your human interactions. Something else. I remember seeing an interview with a small business owner. He was in steel. It's not really some kind of steel contractor. And he was talking about the fact that he could not employ a secretary. He could not employ a human being to answer the phone and take orders and just deal with a few things in the office. And that his type of business, he had to go out and physically visit clients and show them the different grades of metal. Apparently, I believe it. I'm not rolling my eyes, but it's just, apparently there was a lot of going to the site. There was a lot of actually dealing with people. And he said he can't leave the office to do that because he can't employ a secretary. But the cost of employing just one person to answer the phones was now so high where he was living that he couldn't do it. All right. So your business changes. The nature of employment, the way we live together in society changes. I remember too, again, I'm pro minimum wage. Don't get me wrong. When I was a kid, the school employed people to just stand around and do nothing. There was someone who stood by the intersection, as a crossing guard, and there were two people standing in the playground. Or I can remember people being employed to do nothing. Sorry, a lot of public spaces. We get into one of the ones you still see movies making jokes about is having a bathroom attendant. You employ someone at a restaurant or gentleman's club to just stand there at the back. This is not my ideal. It's not my society. And the last time we went into a department store to buy a shirt, actually, I took you to buy this shirt. Now that I think about it, buy this white shirt. I pointed out it would be easier to shoplift than to buy something because it's such a huge store and they have so few employees now. We're walking around trying to find someone we can pay or someone we can ask, where do we pay? It's you have a huge floor, and each floor there's one employee, right, for the whole store, and there's no one else. Why? There are security cameras in theory, right? But so where the number of staff gets cut down. Many times we've gone grocery shopping, and I don't want to use a credit card. I want to pay in cash. Enormous. So I'm remembering this in the States, going to Kroger. It's a famous grocery store in the States. There's a huge, it's the size of a town. It's enormous. Really, it's absolutely enormous, this grocery store. And you get to the front, and there's nobody. There's not even one person employed to stand there and take your money. And it's oh, hey, use the automated computer robot checkout, I don't even have the alternative to line up and use, or sometimes, depending on the time, sometimes there's one person and then they have the automated checkouts. Yes, there are myriad ways in which minimum wage transforms society for the worse. Okay? And let's be all the way real. Within the little pockets of society where labor unions have been powerful and have raised wages within that profession, within that workplace, you already see this pattern playing out. Okay? My father went through school at a time when his teachers and university professors were veterans of World War I. Not World War II, World War I. And there were people who had time in that education system to literally hold his hand and talk. My father was a disadvantaged kid from a single parent home, a single mom in a steelworking town, born and raised poor, and he had different disadvantages. And there were these people who coddled him and encouraged him and told him he could go to Harvard University one day if he worked hard, and he did. There were people who really spent time sitting and talking with him. If you've been watching my channel for some time, I paid thousands and thousands of dollars to study Chinese at the University of Victoria, and nobody ever talked to me, right? Language, you're learning Chinese language. You need someone to sit and talk with you and practice language. Nope. And my first year, the only time I spoke, so this is 1 year of university education. A year does not mean 12 months in the Canadian system. It's a year with quotation marks, right? The first year, the only time I spoke was on the final oral exam. What kind of system of education is this for learning languages, right? But I get it. I mean, each one of these people is being paid $100,000. You have a whole university system where the wages are really high. And, you can look it up. But I mean, the actual wages for even sessional lecturers or whatever, they're listed for UVic, for each university. You can look it up on the internet, what the labor unions agreement is, how much they've been paid. But guess who suffers? Yes, ultimately, students do suffer because they're not being taught. They're faced at the time. So there are incredibly serious disadvantages to having a high minimum wage. There are incredibly serious disadvantages to having minimum wage at all. Hong Kong, when I was there was no minimum wage. And they had restaurants, they had banquet hall restaurants, right? I doubt this exists in Hong Kong anymore because now they do have a minimum wage. But it definitely never existed in Canada. They have a huge, huge room. It's like a football field. Just one huge room with big circular tables throughout the whole thing. And everywhere, basically in between every two tables. So each table could have 6 people at it or 8 people, but could just have 4 people or 2 people at it, right? They're circular tables. Between every 2 tables, there'd be a woman, normally a good-looking woman in a skirt, standing with her hands folded in front of her, doing nothing. Her job is to stand there, right? They were paid incredibly little, right? This is the society without minimum wage. And they're stood there just so that any given time, someone sitting at one of the tables, oh, hey, can they just put up their hands and ask for something? They'll go off and tell the chef, whatever it is. They're a permanently, this was a banquet hall. This was normal in Hong Kong, right? Okay, you have $15 an hour minimum wage. You can't pay people to stand there doing nothing. You reorganize everything. You start being more like the Japanese and having a little intercom system where you press a button on the table. Things change, all right? And obviously, you're talking about education, talking about childcare, talking about, whether it's babysitting or, talking about old folks' homes. There are actually a lot of social services that really matter where this $15 an hour minimum wage is going to change things. And there are going to be people in the old folks' home, frankly, dying in their beds or incredibly uncomfortable, wishing there was someone who could turn them over or help take them to the bathroom or help them when they're lying in a hospital bed in a state of distress, and there's nobody around because now there's only one person for the whole floor instead of 10 people for that floor in the old folks' home, right? Yeah, education is the part of the system I feel most because it's what I'm involved in, but many other social services, they will be eroded by this, okay? Yes. There are ways in which we all embrace and even love the reckless unfairness of the free market. I mean, a whole bunch of people this year got rich off of Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin's a complete scam. I even think it's somewhat immoral. But we don't feel it's an injustice that some people took that risk and got rich off of Bitcoin. And if they got rich off of Bitcoin, it didn't make me any poorer, right? The story of the century is all these people who got rich off of the GameStop short squeeze transaction for one benchmark. A lot of people played this particular stock in the stock market. Maybe someone's watching this video 10 years from now and they've forgotten this. Google it, fascinating footnote in history, right? Some people got fantastically wealthy by buying this stock in the stock market. It's totally unfair. It's totally ridiculous, right? But it's not making me any poorer if you got rich by taking this risk, taking this gamble, right? When we get into these questions of minimum wage and maximum wage, we're talking about that much harder part of politics and political economy in the truest sense of the word, right? Yes, one person is going to get rich and another person is going to get poorer. A whole lot of restaurants that are traditional diners are going to have to shut down and renovate and reopen to look more like Taco Bell, right? To look more like McDonald's, where they just have two people at a counter and they don't have table service. A lot of things are going to have to change, okay? And of course, one of the most obvious ones is, factories. This has even happened in communist China on a massive scale. The number of people employed in manufacturing circuit boards gets smaller and smaller, but the amount the remaining people are paid gets more and more, right? You have more automated, more streamlined process, whereas before there were a large number of unskilled workers just physically placing the chips on the circuit board and the PCB. And you get fewer and fewer people, more advanced machinery, etc., right? But those fewer people are earning a better rate. These, throughout your whole society, this kind of transformation is ongoing. And yeah, there are winners and losers. And guess what? The number of losers is far greater than the number of winners. Okay? But there are some things in politics and economics that are unfair, that we correctly perceive as an injustice, that needs to be redressed, that needs to be fixed. Okay? The fact that a dentist in California is paid so much more than a dentist in Mexico to do exactly the same operation is an injustice. It is an absurdity, and it is even economically irrational. It's bad and evil and wrong. It's bad for the United States of America, and it's bad for Mexico. The fact that there were factories, and yes, I remember reading a case study of a particular factory that literally did this. There were factories that were disassembled in Detroit, transported piece by piece to Mexico, and reassembled in Mexico. The same machinery, not the same bricks, but the actual metal components of the machinery were reassembled. And they started producing these in Mexico just because the wages in Mexico were so much lower. It's bad and evil and wrong. It's unjust, and it's economically irrational. It's bad for the people of Detroit. It's bad for the people of the United States of America, but it's also bad for the Mexicans. All right? If we regard the continent as one unit, you can say, hey, there are first-class citizens and there are second-class citizens here. It's almost like a form of economic racism, right? Oh, yeah, some people, when they do this job in the factory, get paid $15 an hour, and some people get paid $1 an hour to do exactly the same job in the same factory. In that particular case, it was literally the same machinery and the same process, whether it is a dentist or whether it's an auto worker or whether it's a farmer, right? We have this fundamental sense of justice that each man deserves the fruits of his labor, right? But what that means is very much subject to supply and demand. We have an ideal of what the market should be. It should be that whoever makes the best pair of shoes wins. And you know what? China is the best at making certain kinds of shoes, and Italy is the best at making others. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you have no idea. Right? Italy is still the best for making certain kinds of shoes, certain kinds of purses, right? Taiwan makes the best bicycles, both in terms of price and quality. Taiwan makes the best bicycles everywhere in the world. And you know who the competition is? Italy. Italy still makes bicycles, right? Paying a much higher wage. Why? Because they're the best. Okay? We have a sense of what is just and what is right and how the market ought to work. But we know it never can work with this fundamental injustice, this fundamental irrationality of having a $15 an hour minimum wage in one country and a 50-cent minimum wage or a $1 minimum wage in another, sometimes, as in the case of the United States and Mexico, even when they are right next door.